guys, it's GirlGotGame with a final thoughts that's been 2 years in the making. Yes, these are my final thoughts for The Letter, the horror visual novel from Yang Yang Mobile. Naturally, there will be spoilers ahead, so this is your last warning to turn back. Otherwise, let's jump into this. To say that this is a long visual novel is an understatement. Even if you're just doing one run through, it'll take you anywhere from 20 to 25 hours depending on your reading speed. And this is definitely a game that impels you to want to run through more than once if you're a sucker for story like I am. This game also has a huge array of choices that do drastically alter the story in various ways. I'm so thankful they added a butterfly effect flowchart system that you can check as you go through the game. That is super helpful for playthroughs after your first go through, so that you can see what you've done before and try out the other choices to see what changes. Now that being said, the only choice that really majorly impacts story is usually the last choice in any character's respective chapter. But I definitely enjoyed the changes in flavor text, with each run depending on who I was and wasn't close to. That made for some sweet, sad, and sometimes hilarious moments between characters. There were also quite a few different romance endings you could get with the different characters, which, as a dating sim aficionado, I was very happy with. And then, game mechanics-wise, it plays like a standard visual novel, but there's also a few QTEs if you'd like to give yourself a bit of a challenge, and make the scary sections of the game even more scary. Yes, I'm talking about the elevator QTE in particular, I'm looking at that one. I was already scared of elevators, and now I'm even more so, thanks to that QTE event. But they're all implemented well, and I absolutely love that the devs added in an option not only for difficulty, but also to skip them entirely. My only issue with skipping the QTEs is that the transition between before the QTE and afterwards is very jarring and doesn't flow naturally. You definitely feel like something was missed. I think I would have liked one added line of description for those skipped QTE sections to make it flow a little more naturally, but that's really just a small nitpicky thing, and I'm just very grateful to have the option to skip at all. Now, with this obviously being a story-heavy game, how did it do in that regard? In my opinion, the writing was very, very good. In particular, the dialogue between characters I thought was done very well. It felt supernatural, and I don't recall there being any cringy dialogue at all. The characters' backstories were all varied and interesting. The mystery regarding what was happening with the ghosts, the letter, and the mansion was very well done. Definitely had my theory crafting mind turning the entire time I played it, as I kept learning new things each time I played through. Oh, and don't worry, I'm not going to talk about my thoughts on each ending I got in the game, because we'd probably be here for at least another 2 years if I did that. But I do want to comment briefly on the true end, since that was the ending I was working towards all this time. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Granted, it was an extremely sad and bittersweet ending for all the characters involved. To say I got choked up at several points is an understatement, but Ash's death and Luke's sacrifice in particular really got the tear ducts going for me. I will say I was maybe a little disappointed that we didn't get some clearer answers about the curse and the ghost by the end of it all. I still have a lot of questions, like, what was Luke's relation to Edward? Was it just that he looked like him? Why did Charlotte's spirit mix with Takako's? She didn't seem to have any grudges or desires left over that would turn her into a ghost like Takako did. If it was as simple as the ghost killing you traps you in the mansion, then shouldn't Charlotte have been more tied to the mansion rather than tied to Takako? Why did the ghost leave the main cast alone in other ends despite the curse not being lifted? And most importantly, what is the actual deal with the chief, the priest, and the bartender, huh? But seriously, I do still have questions, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. I personally like having basically everything explained at the end of a story, but I know some prefer to have things left open a bit, so it's open to interpretation. That's how you feel about it. But I can at least say I was very happy that the ghost was finally able to be put to rest along with the other trapped souls in the mansion. I think they all had suffered enough for several lifetimes, so all in all, I did enjoy the true ending, but would have preferred a little more explanation regarding certain things. I do also want to say that it's very cruel of the devs to have locked the backstory for the ghost behind killing off these lovable characters. That was very mean. I am just kidding, of course. It does provide good incentive to play through multiple times and actually go through with character deaths if you want more story on the actual mystery behind what led up to the curse. And then just one last comment generally on the writing is that sometimes the writing does suffer from over-explaining / over-describing things instead of just letting the visuals and characters do the talking. That style would definitely work well for a book, but in a visual novel, when you have the art with the backgrounds and the character sprites with the changing of expressions and the music and the sound effects that are helping you visualize what's happening, you don't really need 10 to 15 sentences explaining what's happening in the scene when you can see and hear what's happening. But other than that, I thoroughly enjoyed the writing and story. Next, I want to talk about the art. The art in this game is beautiful. Absolutely stunning 2.5D art with the sprites, the CGs, the background art. There's also always something in motion, which makes the world feel very alive. Even if you're just looking at a background image, if the sun's out, the light will move and flicker, dust will fall, birds and clouds moving by the windows, chandeliers swinging from the ceiling. There's always something moving, and it's beautiful to look at. My only pet peeve with the one thing was the birds flying by. I swear a flock of birds flew by every 3 seconds sometimes in these scenes, and that's a little bit much if you ask me. But other than that, everything else felt natural and looked very pretty. The character sprites are also always in motion with various positions, facial expressions, blinking eyes, breathing, mouth movements when they're talking. It definitely breathed a lot of life into them and made them feel real as well. The CGs were also beautifully illustrated, and there was a good amount of them in each chapter. I will say I was not expecting to see just how gruesome some of those ended up being, especially in the death runs. Let's just say nothing was left to the imagination. Unfortunately, I did have one bug regarding art in this game, and it was a significant moment as well. If you've watched my playthrough, then you'll know which one I'm talking about, but it's the last or second to last, depending on what ending you go for, CG on Ash's chapter with Hannah and or the ghost at the top of the stairs. Unfortunately, mine bugged where Hannah was dead, and yet the ghost was still choking her. That kind of messed up my theory crafting early on in the game because I was wondering how the ghost could speak through Hannah and yet still be next to her. But thankfully a few of you mentioned in the comments that that was not how it was supposed to look, but I am still bummed that that CG never did get fixed. Other than the one bug though, I experienced no other issues art-wise. The sound effects in this game were also done incredibly well. The ambiance of the coffee shop, the busy school hallways, the hush of a too quiet mansion, the static interference of a phone call, all of the sound effects were done very well and also contributed to making this world feel alive. I never came across any sound effect that didn't fit what was happening in the scene, so I thought that was done very well. And of course, I'd be remiss not to comment on the music. There's a great variety in the music in this game, from calm, being out in the park music, to scary tracks that really get your heart racing, to the soft romantic / sad music as well. All of it evokes emotions at the right time based on what's happening in a scene. There's also a few original songs in this as well. The opening, Letters Goodbye, Lone Heart Beats True, which plays during the credits, and Fly, that plays during the last sequence in the true ending. All of those were sung beautifully, and I particularly got emotional during Fly, so definitely a 10 out of 10 on music. And finally, I want to talk about the voice acting. When I first started playing this, I did seriously consider playing it without the voice acting and doing it myself. I ultimately decided against it because the ghost was voice acted, and I felt I'd be missing out on something by turning that off. I'm extremely glad I made that decision because I would have missed out on some absolutely incredible voice acting. The entire cast hit it out of the park, honestly. I think their performance really elevated the characters to a level that may not have been possible without voice acting. I'll say that is for sure a factor for Luke, if nobody else. I'll talk more in depth about Luke later, but suffice to say he's not exactly a good, quote-unquote, person, and he says and does horrible things throughout this game. And yet I ended up really liking him as a character, and I'm convinced it's in no small part due to the way that he was voice acted. Honestly though, everyone was voice acted well, and there was no one in the main cast that I thought the voice didn't fit or anything. It was all very well done. If I had a nitpick, it's only that there's a couple background characters where you can tell They're acted by someone from the main cast and the voice is basically identical to their other voice. That was more amusing than anything, and not something to really gripe about, but I wanted to mention it nevertheless. And of course, where I experience bugs the most is in the voice acting, unfortunately. There were so many times the characters would be having a calm conversation, and then one of them would suddenly scream a line in fear from a different part of the game when that was not what was said at the moment, or someone would talk about a character who had died when they were still very much alive. Definitely jarring when it happened, but it honestly gave me a good chuckle, especially towards the end of playing the game. I hope that's something that could be patched at a later date too, but other than that, definitely no complaints with the voice acting. Everybody did a stellar job. Now, this is normally the part of the video where I rate different route/love interests, but while this game does have romance, that's not really the main focus. I will talk briefly about which couples I enjoyed the most a little later, but I thought what I'd do here is rank each of the characters based on how I like them as characters, as well as how much I enjoyed their chapter in this game. We'll start with my least favorite and work up to the one I enjoyed the most. Starting at the bottom, this probably won't be too much of a surprise for a lot of you. I'm going to have to put Rebecca Gales. The main reason for her being at the bottom is that she's often the cause/at the heart of a lot of the conflict or drama between characters in the game. And this is despite herself and other characters thinking of her as the patient mother hen of the group. Of course, all the characters also mention that she has a hell of a temper, and that once Becca gets going, it's hard to appease her. And honestly, I saw a lot more of the fiery Scottish temper than I did the patient mother hen. A lot of her anger is directed at Bella, and this is because of her jealousy towards her for catching the eye of the guy that Becca's been in love with for 17 years. Now, I will say, this is normal feeling for Becca to be feeling, but I hated how much Becca constantly put down Bella. She also put down Zachary and Ash a lot too, but Bella in particular she was quite nasty with. And that's even when trying to keep positive affection between the two. Now, all that being said, I do actually relate to Becca in a lot of ways with her feelings here. Who knows, that may even be why I ranked her this low, because of how she reminds me of someone I used to be. But I do understand her truly. It just is hard to see her be so angry and snap at her friends constantly. It doesn't really draw me to her as a character. And even towards Ash, who she supposedly loves, she's extremely short and angry with. Granted, she is a tsundere as well, so you could argue that's what's going on there. However, I have to say the version of her that I love best is when she has that honest talk with Luke and he calls her out on her nonsense. Then as she realizes how selfish she's been all this time, as well as how her and Ash are actually different people now than they were when she first fell in love. The changes she makes there and how that comes through and how she interacts with her friends going forward is wonderful to see. I genuinely am always proud of her in those moments. Unfortunately, we only get that side of Becca towards the end of the game, if at all, since it's dependent on the choices you make leading up to that point. The other reason I decided to put Becca at the bottom of my list is also because of her chapter of the game. Not a lot really happens with her, if I'm being honest. For most of it, she's chasing after either Ash or Luke, trying to figure out her love life. And this is true even when her close friend is in a coma or dead. The ghost shows up with Becca probably the least out of all the characters. She's a lot more subtle with Becca. You know, being a shadow, hovering over Luke, making noises in a locker, or smiling at her from the back of her car. The ghost really doesn't take a go at her until the end of her chapter, where it taunts and chases her through the library. And I have to say, I'm honestly really surprised by this. I thought if there was ever anyone the ghost would try to possess, it would be more Becca than Hana. Yes, Hana has the looks of Charlotte, to be sure, but Becca has a lot of the feelings that Takako had. Jealousy, envy, love for someone that did not return her affections. And I do feel there were a couple times that the ghost may have tried to possess her but failed. I would have really loved to see a run where Becca ended up possessed by the ghost and seeing how the main crew reacted to that. But anyways, because Becca caused so much drama in the group, as well as the fact that her chapter doesn't really add much to the story as far as the ghost is concerned until literally the very end when she goes to the library, I decided to have her at the bottom of my list. Next on the list, I'd have to put Marianne McCulloch, which I'm very sad about because I'm genuinely very fond of her, and that's not just because she's Irish, though it certainly plays a part. Marianne is such a force of nature. She's a career woman through and through, very blunt, to the point, can belt out a tune like no one's business, has a weakness for blondes, has a black cat with an awesome name, has an absolutely huge anime poster in her apartment, and she's also an absolute nerd who makes D&D references, and I love her for that. The main conflict she's trying to work through is the guilt of feeling like the rejection of her first love many years ago caused her death, and how she was now having to deal with those feelings again so much, not only because Hana reminded her so much of Lorraine, but also because the ghost literally kept also pretending to be Lorraine. I thought the way that was written was very well done, and my heart definitely went out to Marianne. Because of her working relationship as well as feelings for both rights, we also get quite a bit of insight into both those characters thanks to Marianne. And we learn a lot about the ghost, since she seemed to have taken a particular liking to our Irish giantess, and really torments her by playing on her guilt. All of that was awesome, but I have to be honest, after Marianne's chapter, she kind of becomes a forgotten character. She really doesn't have much of an impact on the characters or story after her chapter concludes. Not saying she doesn't have an impact at all, but I definitely got the sense that she doesn't have as much weight, quote unquote, if you will, like the other characters. I'm sure that's in no small part because she was created as a Kickstarter reward and was not part of the original story. Considering that to be the case, I do think the writers did a great job of adding her in and interweaving her into the story, but when comparing her to the other characters, I unfortunately think she has to be here on my list. Up next, I decided to put Hana Wright, née Evans, here. Hana was such an interesting and likable character. For someone who, quote unquote, was born with a silver spoon in her mouth, she's one of the nicest people in this cast of characters. One side of her is sweet, elegant, refined, with a tendency to mispronounce everybody's names, while the other side of her is full of spunk and fire. When we meet Hana, she definitely has some repressed sadness and anger built up from years of trying to meet society's expectations for her. I will say the one thing I loved about her was that no matter whether she broke up with Luke or stayed with him, she always refound herself in some way. She definitely took control of her life and started doing what made her happy and fulfilled, instead of bowing her head to society, and I loved her for it. She was also a very versatile love interest, having 3 potential people she could have a relationship with, either her husband Luke, the Cinnabon Zach, or our Irish giantess Marianne. And I gotta say, I loved different things about each of those relationships and Hana's interactions with those characters. Now, as far as Hana's chapter is concerned, I thought it was really well balanced between the personal problems she was working through, as well as the ghost shenanigans. Plus, Hana arguably has the most variety in endings to her chapter that affect not only her character arc, but also impacts the rest of the game majorly as well. I was consistently amazed at how much things would change in the rest of the game depending on the choices made in Hana's chapter. The range of endings from working for her happy end with her hubby, to breaking away and starting a new relationship with someone, to being murdered, to being actually possessed by the ghost. There was a lot of variation there, and I loved how those endings played into future chapters. It made the reruns through the game especially interesting. Honestly, there's nothing negative I have to say about Hana. She's only this far down the list because I enjoyed the remaining characters more personally. But I do love you, Hana, really, I promise. Alright, we're at the halfway point, and here I'd have to put Luke Wright. By all rights... Sorry, that was not an intentional pun, I just realized. By all rights, Luke shouldn't really be ranked as high as he is. I mean, aside from being a womanizer, a racist, downright rude to most people, he's also a literal criminal that's responsible for more than a few murders, either by people who work for him or those he's seen to personally. And yet there's something downright likable about the guy. The other side to him that is soft and vulnerable with Hana, that is a good godfather to Kylie, the guy who wants to be better than the awful father he had and who still mourns his mother so many years later. There's more sides to him than that even. Those are just examples, but I honestly think Luke may be the best written character in the game. It's not an easy feat to make someone like him likable, but between the way he was written across chapters and endings, and I think also thanks in big part to the amazing voice performance for him, is what really made Luke one of my favorite characters, and someone who I even got choked up over during his sacrifice in the true ending. The only thing that's pulling Luke down overall for me is his chapter. With it being the culmination of all your choices, it focuses mostly on that and not very much on Luke's contribution to the story. His chapter really is him just having to deal with the consequences of your choices up to that point, with very little input from him on the ending. I also think having to replay the last scene with the ghost and him having their back and forth in the foyer, being flung into the study, and then choosing between setting the letter on fire or the mansion, just made getting through his chapter a huge chore at the end for me. If I was able to skip through a bunch of it on all these runs, it wouldn't have been so bad, but because the game wasn't coded to recognize it as repeated text since it was technically its own branch on the flowchart, it just made it really tedious and hard for me to enjoy that part of Luke's chapter with all these different runs. Now, if it wasn't for that, I think Luke would actually be ranked higher, but just because of that last section of his chapter, I have to put him here at the halfway point. Okay, getting into our top 3 here. At number 3, I'm going to have to go with Ashton Frey. Yes, don't worry, Ash, he beat out Luke for me. I really love Ash. I think my favorite thing about him is how he's a walking contradiction a lot of the time. For example, he's really smart and resourceful when it comes to anything cop-related, but with his friends he can be really dumb and clueless as to their feelings. Or how he'll wax poetic inside his own mind for literal minutes, and then when he opens his mouth, he promptly shoves his foot in it by saying something really insensitive. But all in all, Ash has a very good heart. He cares deeply, maybe too deeply, about his friends, which is understandable considering he blames himself for his parents' divorce, as well as the death of the mother figure in his life, and he fears losing anyone else close to him. Unfortunately, this often leads him to pursue the "I need to protect my friends at any costs" mentality, even if he has to keep them at arm's length to do so. But in the rare moments where Ash lets his guard down, he's really just a big old goober at heart with some pretty awful jokes that I will admit did make me chuckle, and probably one of the best awful ringtones I've ever heard. Where I really love him the most, though, is just his interactions with Isabella. How soft he is with her always makes me melt, and that was what won my love for him more than anything else, I think. And then as far as his chapter is concerned, while there's not a lot of variation in the way his chapter ends, I think his has one of, if not the most, variation or changes in it. With him having strong connections to 3 other characters, plus his chapter being the second to last, means there's a lot of different ways that Ash's chapter plays out. His was probably my favorite tree play over and over because of this. As hard as it was to watch, I was really compelled seeing how Ash handled the different bad fates that could befall his friends, and also how he dealt with it depending on who was left of his friend group to support him through it too. I thought that part of his route was done extremely well. I also thought the writing of him being super skeptical in the beginning and slowly realizing and accepting more and more that there was something supernatural at play was done very well and felt realistic for him as a character. And also the fact that I got choked up every time I had to choose to kill him off means that I was super fond of him, to say the least. So he definitely had to go in my top 3. And with 2 more characters to go, the next one on my list is Zachary Steele, because he is best boy out of all the boys. The gentle giant, the Cinnabon, with an absolute heart of gold and a wonderful talent for cooking. I can't help but love this man. I honestly think we could all use a guy like him in our life. I don't think I can actually think of any negative qualities for him. Even when he's angry, he rarely is rude or insulting, and when he does get angry, it's with very good reason, and is a controlled anger as well. It honestly still boggles my mind that Becca is the one who is viewed by the group as the patient one, who smooths things over with everyone, because that title should hands down go to Zachary. He diffused and smoothed things out between characters more than anyone else. I think also Ash's description of him as being the Watson to his Holmes is very apt, since Zachary is also very smart and capable, but sometimes his big heart moves him to make choices that are not necessarily the smartest or safest. He always acts out of concern for others, so his heart's in the right place, but he can and does get himself into trouble as a result of that. And of course, my heart definitely went out to him, considering the backstory we learned for him. It's honestly inspiring that even though he witnessed his parents murdered in front of him from a race hate crime, and has been suffering from trauma and horrific nightmares for years afterwards, that he has so little animosity towards anyone. He is kind, considerate, and works hard to not dwell on the past but work towards a better future, and trying to bring attention to a topic and issue so near and dear to him. So, yeah, I have a lot of love and respect for Zachary. He's very much one of the good ones. And then as far as this chapter, I thought his was another one that had a very good balance between ghost shenanigans and his regular routine with his friends. I really love that even though he was a little skeptical regarding the ghost's existence, he readily and quickly acknowledged that something really wasn't right, and did an investigation to try and prove it to himself either way. Zachary's chapter is also interesting in that he could spend quite a bit of time with either crew, either his friend group of Ash, Bella, and Becca, or more with Luke, Marianne, and Hannah in particular. And what he learned and didn't learn depending on those choices definitely had an impact on the story later on. So with all that taken into account, Zach's definitely my number 2. And finally, with only one character left, Isabella Santos is definitely my number 1. I absolutely love her character and think she was the perfect one to start this whole game. She's extremely likable. She wears her heart on her sleeve. She's spunky and stubborn, very optimistic and hopeful. And despite what most characters say and are surprised by, I've always felt she had this wonderful maturity with which she approached situations too. Sure, she can be a little impulsive, and can sometimes have a short fuse for becoming irritated, but that's part of her charm too. She just feels very real. While I personally can't relate to her exact situation, where she's far from home to take care of her dad and the rest of her family while putting her dreams on hold, the feelings she had regarding those issues were definitely very relatable, and it drew me to her even more. And honestly, her being terrified of the ghost and believing it's real from the get-go was something that nicely set her apart from all the other characters that were super skeptical about the whole thing. I think she also may have had the greatest overall development as a character. Despite the challenges she was dealing with before the ghost, she definitely had this very youthful optimism to her and would approach some things maybe not as seriously as she could have done. But as the story progresses, that small seed of maturity she had really grows more and more. You can see how she develops this quiet strength and resolve, and it was wonderful to see that character growth from her. And then as far as her chapter was concerned, very well balanced. Arguably the most balanced writing-wise out of all the characters in my opinion. Isabella has meaningful interactions with all the characters in some fashion. There's a lot of ghost spooks. It sets a great tone for the beginning of the game and really draws you in to play more. Isabella also has 3 different endings to her chapter that drastically changes the story for all the characters going forward. All in all, I loved Isabella as a character, and I thought the pacing of her chapter was done incredibly well, so she's very much earned her top spot on my list. And there you have it. That is my definitive list for the characters and their chapters in this game. As a bonus list, I do want to just quickly rank the romances that were available in this game because I would definitely be remiss if I neglected to do that. So my least favorite pairing is probably Ash and Becca. I'm sorry, Becca. I know you've been yearning for that boy for 17 years, but it just doesn't really feel that natural from Ash's side of the story. And the difficulty involved in actually getting those two to end up together just leaves me with the impression that it's sort of a forced pairing and may not last for the long haul. After them, I'd probably put Hannah and Marianne. I think the two of them are really cute, but there's honestly just too little romantic interaction between the two of them throughout the story that I couldn't get that invested in it. Next would be Luke and Marianne. They rank slightly higher than Hannah and Marianne just because I feel the two of them actually had some pretty good chemistry together. I really enjoyed their banter together. The reason they're not higher is simply because I'm not convinced this is a relationship that would actually work out for the long run since their interests are pretty different. But hey, maybe they could prove me wrong. But my gut feeling is that it wouldn't last very long. After them, I'd rank Luke and Becca. The two of them complement each other very well, I think. Becca's definitely tough enough to not put up with any garbage from Luke, and is actually successful at getting him to behave from time to time. And as for Luke, he doesn't have any qualms about calling a spade and telling her straight to her face when she's being ridiculous. I like the fact that they both could dish back and forth to each other in equal measure, and that there was also this healthy measure of respect and admiration for each other in just the short time they were getting to know each other. They definitely had chemistry together, and I enjoyed this pairing quite a bit. Next up on my list would be Hannah and Zachary. The two of them are just absolutely precious together. Zach's a great guy, and Hana's a great lady, and together they make a great couple. But seriously, I really just loved the soft playfulness between the two, and I'm kind of a sucker for two people from different sides of the tracks falling for each other. I also just think they complement each other very well, and that they can both learn a lot from each other considering the very different lives they've led. Coming up to our last two pairings now, at number 2 would be Luke and Hana. Honestly, I think they're just a great match, and it was so heartwarming and satisfying seeing them patch their marriage up together. I just loved the small moments between them where they were able to let their walls down and just be themselves with each other, despite having to put on certain appearances for others. It speaks volumes to how much they truly care for each other, and there's a side to Luke you only see thanks to Hana's influence, and it always gave me the warm fuzzies. Gosh, I could just gush about the two of them forever, but suffice to say, this pairing has a very special place in my heart, and I absolutely was gutted whenever I had to do an ending that involved them not being together as a couple. And finally, coming at number 1, to no one's surprise, I'm sure, is Ash and Bella. Ah, young love. This is another instance of seeing a side to a guy you don't normally see, and Bella brings that out of Ash like no one else can. For someone who's really jaded and cynical, and who usually keeps everyone at arm's length, to be so soft and open and vulnerable for her, who wants to be the best person he can be to be worthy of her, I just loved that so much. And while Isabella may have been denying it to herself for a long time, she's fond of Ash in a way she is with no one else. They really get along like an old married couple more than anything, constantly teasing and bickering with each other, but always with a playful undertone and genuine fondness for the other. How devastated they are if something happens to the other also always pulled at my heartstrings. Ash and Bella are definitely my OTP for this game. And with that wraps up my ranking of the possible couples in this game. And I do actually have a couple bonus award thingies for the letter as well. Favorite QTE would have to be the one in Hana's chapter when the ghost is trying to possess her. It was one that had the least scary thing happening in the background and was also straightforward to pass. QTE that scared me the most was hands down the elevator one. I suck at typing numbers as is, and then when you have a ghost spider crawling towards you with a menacing smile on her face, that makes it so much worse. I do want to shout out the camera QTE in Zachary's chapter too, though, because it is scary turning around in a fog, hearing sobbing that progressively turns to laughter the more you fail at finding her and taking her picture. Scariest moment in the game overall for me was the end of Isabella's chapter. Being stuck in the office with the ghost slowly walking by while Bella's praying under her breath and trying not to make noise was so scary. Plus, when that happened in my first playthrough, I had no idea if Bella even survived or not, so that moment definitely sticks out to me. Favorite romantic moment for me is actually a tie between Luke singing to Hana while he holds her in bed, and the confession/kiss scene in the attic between Ash and Bella. Both are wonderful moments and I couldn't choose between them. And speaking of romance, a couple that I would have liked to see that wasn't in this would be a Zachary and Rebecca pairing. Despite the fact they often felt awkward around each other, I think they actually balance each other pretty great. Where Zach will shrink back from an escalating situation and let himself be insulted, Becca steps up and defends him. When Becca's upset or angry, Zachary knows just what to say to get her to calm down. I really strongly felt they'd be a good couple, in particular during Isabella's coma end. They spent a lot of time together, and their interactions really made me feel like they would have been a good potential couple as well. Favorite piece of music is hands down the sad piano music that plays during many touching moments during the game, such as when Bella is talking to Ash about her father, or when Luke has his final moment at the end of the true end with Becca, Zach, and Bella. That's such an emotional piece and always gets me choked up. I do want to give a special shout out to the crazy piano piece that plays whenever the ghost is chasing you though. That definitely gets the adrenaline pumping and is a great horror track. Most gruesome death for the characters would definitely have to be Bella's. Poor girl was absolutely taken apart. Saddest death for me would have to be Ashton's. And I think for my final bonus award, my favorite CG in the game, which was a tough one considering how many gorgeous ones there are, but I have to say Hana and Zachary's dance outside with the fireflies has to be my favorite. I love the lighting, the expressions on their faces, and it has this fairy tale quality to it and is definitely my favorite one. And there you have it. My final thoughts for the letter has come to a close. In summary, it was great. It was a long journey over 2 years and 200 hours played, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. While there were some bugs and some things about the writing that could have been better, it definitely didn't take away from my overall enjoyment of this game, and I'm really glad I pushed through and saw everything it had to offer. To say you can get your money's worth from this visual novel is an understatement, and I am thoroughly impressed with how much your choices affect the overall story. Yang Yang did an absolutely incredible job, and I would definitely happily recommend it to anyone. With that, I hope you all enjoyed going on this journey with me. I really appreciated your continued support through the 2 years I was playing it, so thank you guys for joining me. I definitely enjoyed experiencing it with you all. And if you'd like, I'd love to hear your final thoughts on the game. And if you'd like to answer the bonus award thingies I made up here, feel free. Or if you came up with your own, I'd love to hear that as well. But that is it for me. It's with quite a bit of sadness that I say goodbye to this game. I'm going to miss all of these characters, but I am also looking forward to having a new game to play on Sundays. And it is kind of something familiar to me as well, considering it's the latest installment in a series I've played quite a bit on this channel already. So with that being said, I will be playing Life is Strange 3 on Sundays for the next little bit, so hopefully I will see you there. But either way, thanks so much for listening to my review. I hope you enjoyed it. And until next time, I will see you later.